What's up? I am David Long. This video is a clip from my recent video, Why Non-Reductionism is a Better Meta-Theory. If you enjoy this clip, consider watching the full-length video. When I came across Ken Wilber, one of the reasons that I felt really comfortable being in the integral community was that Wilber suggested this idea that he called the pre-trans fallacy, or the pre-trans distinction. And he explicitly said that he was influenced by Joseph Campbell, same as me. And so he made this distinction between literal, magical, mythical ideas that are pre-rational and metaphorical ideas, poetic ideas that are trans-rational.
Joseph Campbell, probably the recent era's greatest mythologer and interpretive mythology, and somebody I certainly cut my teeth on. I was a great admirer of his and a really extraordinary work that he did. He used to very vehemently, actually, say that there's really sort of two types of mythology, or mythology forms two different functions. He wouldn't use the terms pre-rational and trans-rational, but the way we're talking about them is the way he would talk about these two functions of mythology. And the first function is when mythology is taken to be concretely real. But what some people do, particularly educated, intelligent people like us that are trying to get some meaning in our lives, we can tend to take myths as deeply symbolic of something else. Campbell knew this, as if the capacity to form a cognition that says it's as if this is the case, it's transrational. It can represent a deeper self, a higher self. It can represent oneness with all of reality. So that's a very distinguishing way to tell the difference between pre-rational myths that are taken to be concretely, literally true, and trans-rational myths that may represent some very high transpersonal dimensions. And the problem, again, with the pre-trans fallacy is that people like Freud take every trans-rational, as if higher mythology and reduce it to two-year-old infantile nonsense. And on the other hand, way too many people take a lot of the pre-rational stuff and elevate it to trans-rational glory it just doesn't have.
From the outside, how do you know if this person's operating at a pre-rational or trans-rational level? Would it be if they were able to say, I'm going to act as if?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you ask them exactly what is it that you're doing. If they're making an empirical claim, check it empirically. On the other hand, it can be a very high kind of metaphoric and as-if interpretive tool.
And so I felt safe in this community, like this is a community of people who understand the difference between rationality and poetry, between the cup and the sword, and who could make these skilled distinctions. What I later found out through interactions with this community and through understanding the theory more in context is that there's actually a pre-trans fallacy at the heart of integral theory. Wilber himself, as I'm saying, believes in a Eastern creationist, literal, magical, mythical worldview, where he thinks consciousness is the ground of being, and he believes in spirit through time.
Love is not just a feeling. You are actually feeling a force that stretches throughout the universe and goes all the way back to the Big Bang and the ground of all being, one's truest and deepest self, infinite, unbounded, unlimited, and driven top to bottom by love. This love is fundamentally who and what you are. This love is timeless and eternal, present from the very beginning, and fundamentally continuing to drive evolution right now. An ever-present unity that has been here from the very beginning and all along, the force that moves the sun and other stars. Here, the deepest secrets of the universe show themselves.
Absolute subjectivity is a pure self. It's vast emptiness, vast openness. And you experience this emptiness and openness because it's a space in which everything is arising right now. Fundamentally, it's waking up to this pure self. God is pure subject in you. Show me the face you had before your parents were born. That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth. Before the Big Bang, I am. This I amness is pure spirit and is the fundamental creatrix of everything that's arising. Pure awareness, pure self, your true self is the space in which all of this is arising.
And it actually shows up in relation to most of the elements in his version of meta-theory. For example, he has stacked Aurobindo's state stages on top of developmental psychology, on top of spiral dynamics, and corrupted the developmental model, basically implying that these mystical religious believers are actually at the highest stages of development. Wilber believes in reincarnation, and he even believes that people who are at higher stages of development are able to get there because of virtues from their past life. And he frames all of development in this way of talking about it like spirit moving through time. Very Hegelian. My perspective and spiral dynamics is actually more in line with dialectical materialism, which, by the way, is a very different thing from reductionist materialism or empirical reductionism. Obviously, ontologically, we take into account all four quadrants. It's just that we don't think that the interior quadrants go all the way down and back. We know from science that consciousness is a later historical emergent, and subjectivity variety is an epiphenomenon of the brain. There's also a problem with an overemphasis on state training, and even the states themselves are framed in terms of a Buddhist worldview. Like the waking state is called gross, and the deep sleep state is called causal. So the idea here being that consciousness is more fundamental, and the regular waking world is like just the base level, the gross level of things, that if you really see past it, you'll get more to like the causal, more fundamental, more real things, which are this pure consciousness and stuff. So basically what I'm saying is every element of integral theory has been corrupted by literal fundamentalist religious belief of the Eastern variety. About 10 years ago, I started making some of my first integral videos. And at the time, I was teaching lots of people integral theory. Even then, I was teaching a fixed or improved, more healthy version of integral theory, and really wishing there was something I could point them to. I was giving the same lessons to individuals over and over again. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to make some videos about some of this stuff. And I was largely motivated by the fact that there wasn't really any good intro material. All the intro material was kept behind a paywall. And even then, it wasn't really very good. The Integral Life website was basically just a bunch of famous people talking to Ken Wilber and being convinced of integral ideas. There wasn't really good intro material. I also started making some videos that were critical of some of Ken Wilber's ideas. And I was even starting to offer some small upgrades. In 2018, I came out with a video making a distinction between Davidian and Wilberian integral, and I introduced my own Davidian integral map. It included some upgrades in relation to quadratic primacy. It had a focus on emergentism, and we took away the mystical corruption in the stages of development, which is one of the reasons why Don Beck really liked me and wanted to work with me, because he thought I was going to restore integrity in the meta theory community to spiral dynamics, his life work. We tried several times to be able to meet up in person. For a while, I was living in Texas like him, but unfortunately, we were never able to make that happen before he died. Although, like I said, he did send me all of his books, and he would reach out to me from time to time complaining about Wilber. One time I even asked him on his page what he thought about third tier and Aurobindo state stages, and he basically accused Wilber of not really knowing what the higher stages of integration were really about, not really representing them himself. And he challenged Wilber to a debate and said that he didn't think that Wilber would ever debate him because he just hides out in his loft in Denver and avoids all of his critics. By the way, I think literally every public debate that has happened in the integral community has included me. One time I even debated 2 integral professors at once. Okay, let's talk pros and cons. Integral theory, pros. You have the AQAL elements, all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types. Pretty good start for a holistic approach. You have an explicit map, the whole worldview expressed in one page, one basic image, which is a good start for really being able to dig into the meta theory, and it gives people something to reference back to. I think that's a really good thing, and I think it's really important and helpful. Another really good thing is the fact that developmental psychology is scientific, and stages are rooted in a meta-analysis of developmental psychology, at least up to a point. There's some good academic and scientific grounding and rational language. Ken Wilber is a founder, so there is some kind of a person who is the origin of the theory who we can point to as a person of authority. That has its issues too, but we'll get to that later. Also, there's the idea of depth and span, or horizontal and vertical development. So often in the past, so many different people just pointed to horizontal development or vertical development, and it's very rare that you see somebody who's talking about both. Also, of course, there's the pre-trans distinction. Pre-trans rational, pre-trans egoic, pre-trans conventional. Again, there's some problems with this, but this is a really helpful distinction. There's some certain parts of the theory that could be reframed, such as eros and agape, maybe if they weren't concepts specifically tied to the idea that love goes all the way down and all the way back, but just masculine and feminine aspects of love. Fine, great. Also, non-duality. If we're talking about including both absolute and relative truth and holding them both at the same time, as long as we're not making unfounded claims about the absolute. Like if we're talking about absolute unity and interconnectedness as well as relative distinctions, fine, great, good. Now, when it comes to the cons, of course, I've already mentioned, there's a bias conflationary integration that privileges Eastern religious ideas, and also the upper left quadrant and state training. Most of the problems come back to this one problem. It's even hard to tease them all apart because they're all so interconnected. This bias ends up corrupting every element, and it also ends up breaking its own rules when it comes to integration. So you have a religious cosmology at the heart of this theory. Wilber believes in free will and souls and reincarnation. Wilber believes in psychics.
Meta-analyses of precognition, telepathy, and so on have shown almost 100% certainty that they exist. I think it's really only as those that were crazy enough to believe in it really started doing research on these areas, and we got some real data that those who are actually data-oriented or evidence-oriented, if they looked at it, they tended to believe it. And I've seen a lot of people's responses that, no, I think it's really there. That's why all of these psychic events of subtle paranormal phenomena were called paranormal. Normal people don't have precognition or clairvoyance.
There's a lot of woo-woo ideas in the community. Wilber ends up endorsing minority positions in the scientific community, even some creationist ideas as it relates to evolution. Aurobindo is where the word integral comes from. There's a problem of acting like they're doing some kind of a real meta-analysis when they're mixing in the mystic Aurobindo with developmental psychology. There's also a corruption of the colors, negating the dialectic that was built into it through spiral dynamics. Wilber kind of moved over to this sort of light spectrum way of talking about stages where blue is called amber and yellow is called teal. And he stacks on third tier Aurobindo state stages as if being a mystic is the highest stages of development. And there's all kinds of problems with that. Previous versions of the map were calling third tier stages psychic. And they're also saying things like construct awareness and ego awareness aren't things that happen until third tier, when really they can happen at much earlier stages like green. And so you have people who are construct aware and ego aware, still in late first tier stages, thinking that they're at the highest stages of development. It's a real problem. And of course, there's a very Buddhist take on the states, where the body and the material world are considered gross, and the deep sleep or pure consciousness, empty consciousness like nirvikalpa samadhi are related with the causal, or like true self, things like that, as if like your true self is pure consciousness. Of course, this whole favoring of Eastern religious worldviews is qualifying the unqualifiable. It's looking in the wrong quadrant for data. It's a pre-trans fallacy. He talks about deep science as a way to justify this religious belief, where he tries to disqualify people who think otherwise about these things, basically saying that you aren't qualified to judge unless you yourself have had these experiences. But he'll also disqualify people who have had these experiences, who don't agree with the interpretations of those experiences. So basically, if you don't agree with him, you're wrong. And of course, there are people who have gotten into these states who don't agree with this translation. And let's be real, I don't have to do something like go to church and have a worship experience to understand why Christianity is wrong. Just like one wouldn't also have to get into a special state to know that the logic and the translation around what it means to be in that state isn't valid. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, a lot of the people in these spaces, including Wilber himself, kind of just use the idea of this hierarchy to feel special personally. They say that the reason they're at these high stages is because they've done work in their past lives and they reincarnated in a way that allowed them to develop faster than others. So not only are they more mature in this lifetime, but they're more mature than other people across many lifetimes. So not only do these people think that they're smarter than other people now, they think that there's nothing that these people could even do in this lifetime that would make them smart and wise and mature.
There's really only two things that you carry with you from life to life. And one is the repository of your virtue, and the other is the repository of your wisdom. Wisdom in Buddhism is defined in one way, your capacity to understand emptiness. And virtue is defined as your capacity to do good works, ethics. It also explains one of the most difficult things that developmental psychologists face. We have no idea why people transform. Anybody who's a parent has 3 children knows that they come with souls, and they are 80% formed. And you treat them all the same, and you've got a doctor, a bank robber, and a serial murderer. And the easiest way is to just say reincarnation. They come with this repository. If you reached turquoise in your previous lifetime, you are going to hit the ground running and get to turquoise as early as you possibly can, and then start from there. Let's say if last time in your life you got up to magic, then this time you're born, you're going to go through those stages fairly quickly without any problem, and then your challenge will be to move into mythic and rational structures. So that's what would happen in your adult life, is you would settle into the next level or wave that you're to work on, and kind of stick with that for a while.
And I think it does take a mind predisposed. I think you have to be almost born with a desire to do that, because otherwise you won't care. And we simply, for whatever reason, we're one of the kooky, far out people that are plugged in to that central drive of the cosmos.
This is some next level elitism. And it really shoots the developmental project in the foot. This is also why they're not really that interested in transformation, that they're more talking about translation, because it's a condescending approach to development. Well, I'll speak to people on their level, but will they ever be able to really understand me on my level? Probably not. So all translation, no transformation. One time I even heard someone ask Ken Wilber, why should we care?
Why should we care?
If you're in a dream at night and there are thousands of people starving, there are two ways you can stop their hunger. One is in the dream you can try to feed them all, or the second is you can wake up, and that will end their suffering immediately.
Now, you can probably understand why this is a terrible answer, because it's basically acting as if other people's suffering isn't real. And I can just wake up personally, be enlightened myself, and then I don't have to care about other people's suffering. This is not wisdom. This is a shameful answer. And it really explains why he only writes these books. He brags about the fact that he never shows up, even though showing up is one of the 4 ways to be healthy in each quadrant. There's showing up, growing up, waking up, and cleaning up. But he doesn't show up.
You want to not only grow up and wake up and clean up, but if you want to show up for reality. I myself never attended a single integral conference, and I never got on a chat room or discussion board.
He doesn't show up in the online forums. He doesn't show up at any of the integral conferences. He doesn't show up for debates. Imagine if you were the founder of a philosophical community and never showed up in any of your online forums, and there were conferences in the name of your brand of philosophy, but you made a virtue of the fact that you never show up to them. Isn't that crazy? Here's a philosopher who's never been in a public debate. That's crazy. I've been in lots of debates. So, of course, there's no leadership, there's no goals, there's no big picture plan. It's a pat yourself on the back and feel special for thinking that you're at the highest stages of development type of community. It's basically turned into a Ken Wilber cult of personality. He's surrounded himself by yes men. He never debates, he never addresses his critics. And you can see in some of the videos that I've made, or the Integral World site that Frank Visser made, or a note that Ken Wilber made about his critics, the ERPI episode that's pretty well known in the integral community. There is no room for criticism. Anytime anyone criticizes or offers upgrades, there is a very cult-like response, like, who do you think you are? How dare you? How dare you question Ken Wilber? You think you're as wise as him? Even in that Wyatt Earp note, Wilber says that when you're the Wyatt Earp of philosophy, every punk with a pea shooter wants to come and try you. The pioneer is the one with all the arrows in his back. As if anybody who criticizes is just coming for the throne. There's a bunch of smart people who learned integral theory, who read all these books, who learned as much as they could from Wilber, and this is how they get treated when they bring their critical feedback or their ideas for upgrades. They get told, sit down and shut up, who do you think you are? And let's be real, there's a lot of smart people who have a lot of different perspectives, coming from a lot of different areas of expertise, and I'm sure that many of them have valuable criticisms and ideas to bring to the table. Integral is supposed to be the best at processing tensions, but that's not what we see at all. They don't apply these integral governance methods to be able to integrate in the best into their meta theory and continue to upgrade it. Not at all. And so integral theory has become a type of dogma. Even though he's kind of the first word on meta theory, his arrogance, calling himself the Einstein of consciousness, and refusing to engage, it's ultimately why meta theory will grow beyond him. And this is why I won't speak about him as a figure worthy of respect. And his policy of actively ignoring all of his critics makes me want to not acknowledge him or the integral brand, especially not with any enthusiasm or positivity moving forward. In fact, I'll try not to mention them after this video. The information is out there, and this video is here. All my past videos are still available, so let's call it good enough and move forward. So Ken Wilber's overly sensitive. He doesn't do debates. There's no processing of criticism within his community. There's no upgrades to his theory that don't come from him. That's a problem. Again, that's why it's dogmatic. The last version of the integral map is 18 years old. There haven't been any improvements made on it since 2007. It's excessively colorful and a little bit overly simplistic. Another problem is that, in a lot of ways, integral theory kind of just ends up being a classification game. Well, this goes in this quadrant and that goes in that quadrant. But there's no prioritization. And they even talk about just giving equal emphasis to all quadrants. But if I'm trying to solve a problem and I get data data from all of these different categories, well, what is the most important data? What data from what category trumps the other data? Integral methodological pluralism doesn't really work, and most people don't know how to use it. Another problem is this emphasis on the upper left quadrant. It's not just embedded in the theory. There's also not really good, healthy manifestations as it relates to the other quadrants in practicality either. There's not really any action in the world, there's not a healthy community, and there are no structures or plans or goals about what we're trying to do with any of these things. Really, the only goal is feel smart and live a more healthy, holistic life for yourself. Integral life is basically just a self-help business with some yes men talking heads who repeat things that Wilber has already said. In fact, for years, Ken Wilber has just been teaching the same ideas over and over and over again. At a certain point, it's redundant to even listen to him because he won't say anything new. Even though they've had a YouTube channel for something like 20 years, they have tons of guests on there, and Ken Wilber himself is on there. Their YouTube channel only has something like 20,000 subscribers. And in the last 5 years, I think their biggest video in terms of views is just one where Ken Wilber starts wearing a wig. That one got some thousands of views, but most of their other videos only get like 500 views. My last video that I put out after taking some years off on a channel that has just under 2,000 subscribers got 1,000 views in just a couple days. Imagine if I had 20,000 subscribers. All of the integral groups that you're going to find online are integral in name alone. And unfortunately, in these groups, you can even find some pretty terrible ideas being spread around. People supporting Trump, people making sexist and racist comments, and these people aren't even kicked out of the group. There's also no healthy standards for leadership or who's allowed to be in the group. For a long time, the main audience for integral ideas has been postmodernists and New Agers and Buddhists. So the community is basically filled with these kinds of people. In these communities, what you'll really find are not really people who even know meta theory. Most of them are just smart-sounding New Agers. And to the extent that they will reference meta theory, it will just be meta theory in service of some postmodern idea. Ken Wilber used to say things like, if you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, it's because you're already at these stages. Otherwise, you wouldn't be interested in this content. And he would say things like, everybody's right. All worldviews have a piece of the truth, and nobody's smart enough to be wrong all the time, to appeal to postmodernists. But it's also true to say all of these worldviews are wrong. They're all limited and reductionist, and they all think that they're the one true way when they're not. There are pieces of truth to be integrated from all of them, but if you're a believer in any of these particular worldviews, you have a partial, limited, and reductionist view. So this is just selling integral ideas to green people. And why would you do that? Well, you would do that if you have a business. You would do that if the goal is to sell books and to sell things. Otherwise, ideally what you should do is that you should find people who are already at this level, people who are already making implicit integral distinctions, and give them a meta map. That's a developmentally appropriate thing to do. It's actually dangerous and unskillful to give, in particular, stages of development as an idea to people at lower levels of development because they will use these ideas in a violent and unskillful way. Less of a problem with things like quadrants, but in particular stages is not something that you want to teach to people in first tier. Most of the good and smart people who actually care about these ideas don't engage in the online groups and eventually leave the community and leave integral behind. Kind of being like, yeah, it was helpful to learn some of those maps and some of those ideas, but I really don't want to be associated with the community. I'll take some of these ideas and go now. That's kind of the general way that most people engage with integral. There have also been problems where Wilber ends up endorsing gurus or spiritual teachers that have alleged abuse and even alleged PDF files who have sexual allegations against them. Don't at me. You can look it up. It's all very much on the record. All in all, integral is a pretty embarrassing thing to be associated with. And that's why there have been offshoot movements like metamodernism and now non-reductionism who want to secularize and distance themselves from the integral brand and associations with Ken Wilber and this community. It seems to me that integral is fizzling and failing. There used to be emerging meetups. There used to be conferences. There used to be a community center. There used to be integral things happening and going on. All of these projects have fizzled and failed. The community center closed. There's no meetups. Integral Institute, which was supposed to be some kind of a think tank for Integral. That also failed. They were trying to have Integral courses and Integral accreditation at colleges, and most of those colleges have closed and or stopped teaching Integral theory. There are still a couple online type colleges or woo-woo colleges that will offer degrees in Integral theory, but those colleges also are studying subtle energy healing or offering degrees in modern shamanism and extraterrestrial studies and how to communicate with animals and psychedelic healing and things like that. So, like I said, these are the kind of new age woo-woo type things that Integral has sadly been associated with. And like I said, there isn't really good intro material anywhere. There are some courses, but they're all behind paywalls. This is why people like me had to start making intro material on YouTube, because it didn't exist. And of course, lots of people have been very critical of the very expensive courses and events that used to happen, but are not really available anymore. There's nothing going on. It's basically over. One of the big criticisms of Ken Wilber when he came out with Integral was that he didn't come up with any of those things, that he was just taking a bunch of other people's work and packaging it together and selling it as his own. The word integral comes from integral yoga and Aurobindo, and that's where also the state stages and the words gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual as it relates to states comes from. The stages are generally taken from spiral dynamics and the work of Claire Graves and Don Beck. The lines of development come from developmental psychology, and obviously types already existed. The only thing that Wilber really contributed in this mix is the idea of quadrants, and some distinctions about the interplay between some of these elements. Earlier in this video, we already talked about how divisions of four already existed, and basically we're just applying something like yin and yang to ontology. I think you could say that quadrants is basically divisions of four applied to ontology. And this tool wasn't invented by Ken Wilber. Other people have used it in the past, like Carl Jung used it to come up with MBTI types, and the different mental functions are basically quadrants within quadrants. Basically, divisions of four is just yin and yang. You have duality, which is a unity, and even within that duality, there are these little dots. So if you take that and you twist it, then you have individuals and collectives, interiors and exteriors, as it would relate to ontology. So, I mean, yeah, we can give him at least partial credit for that. Did Wilber come up with the pre-trans fallacy? Well, kinda. He says that he is basically saying the same thing as Joseph Campbell, and he doesn't really follow that rule himself, so what's really the value of coming up with a distinction if you don't also apply it yourself? And he often does confuse and conflate pre-trans rational and pre-trans egoic. Some people have also suggested that it might be better to call trans-rational post-formal because there's a lot of confusion in the community about what trans-rational even means. A lot of people will use the word trans-rational while they're committing pre-trans fallacy number 2. On the topic of putting things on the table that nobody really uses or even understands in the community, integral methodological pluralism. We could say that Wilber came up with that, but it's not really good and nobody understands it or uses it really. And again, it's just kind of another bad categorization game. The Wilber-Combs matrix. Yeah, that's good. Understanding the relationship between states and stages, I think that's pretty helpful. In that same kind of vein, we have depth and span. That's also a pretty useful distinction. Maybe there's a couple more as well. So Wilber came up with some stuff, but if we're being honest, Wilber's project of integration is conflationary and reductionist and biased, so it's not really good integration. I personally learned a lot from both the pros and cons of being in the integral community for some years. I learned a lot of good things that I would want to keep and incorporate, and a lot of the ways that it can fail and go wrong, and how to avoid some of those problems. So I'm very grateful for my time as a member of the integral community. So I'm sure some people who are watching this are going to have some kind of criticism of these pros and cons lists. What I would encourage you to do is make your criticisms and make your own pros and cons list in the comments. All right, thanks so much for watching. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Support me on Patreon. Big thanks to my Patreon supporters. And remember, if you like this video, go check out the full-length video where I talk about my history with meta theory, the pros and cons of integral theory, the pros and cons of metamodernism, and the upgrades that non-reductionism brings to the table. Thanks again for watching. Peace.